everybody. Welcome back to the Brandon and Joe podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Allisa Ciccia. She received her master's in IO psychology from Fairfield University and then her PhD in IO psychology from Hofstra University, which Brandon and I know very well. She has past experience as an adjunct professor and currently works for the Federal Reserve as a senior organizational effectiveness strategist. Welcome, Allisa. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Brandon and Joe. Thanks for having me. Before we get started, just a quick disclaimer. So anything I say today is my thoughts and my opinions of myself and not of the Federal Reserve or the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is where I currently work.
Yep. Thank you. I think the last time we talked, we were at one of those Metro events, which I know we bring up a lot. I think it was called like Pearl Alley. Do you remember what the place was called?
Yeah, I think it was Pearl Alley. Yeah.
I that was like the first time I was ever there, and I was like, I have to go back there like every weekend now because it was so cool. I've never been to a place like that. It's like boats everywhere, and like it's like, oh, this place is all. We should have every Metro event there.
It's a cool area in downtown. I'm on the board of Metro with Jared, who I know obviously talks about Metro all the time, if he's on here or any of the other Metro members. So it's a good group of us. So we're happy that y'all were able to make it.
Yeah, luckily I'm also partially with you as a social chair for Metro. So I wasn't able to be there at that dinner because I was out. But I'm happy to be back now, and I'm excited to get to work with you on that too.
Yeah, it's cool. It's a lot of fun. Like, it's not super intensive in the sense of like so much work, but like so much bang for your buck as far as like getting to meet a lot of IOs in the area and just talk shop all day.
Yeah, we have the event coming up in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. We have the event coming up on the 17th.
Yep. Yeah. Should be a good series. We have a good speaker coming up.
Machine learning.
I'm excited because I think some of our the first years in our program will get to like experience that right away. Because Brandon, if I remember, I don't think we got to do it until like halfway through our program. So Hofstra, kind of like applied our memberships, but it wasn't until like January, and we were already like a semester in. But our lucky first years will now get it right away. A little jealous, but it'll be like a great experience for them. You guys are right. You guys do an amazing job.
Yeah, or they may have, it may deter them from IO psych, which is all good too. Like it's not for everybody, but I guess the three of us obviously agree it is for us. So.
Yeah, Joe and I have talked about that too. At this point of our careers, it's just as important to learn about what you don't want to do, and that's a great point, Allisa, that you made there.
Yeah. It's like, it took me, I would say, pretty far into my like studies of IO psych to figure out like, okay, I actually don't like this side of IO psych, and I don't want to throw any shade on any area. But yeah, there's just some pieces of it and like I said, I don't want to throw any shade on anything, but like personnel selection is not for me, right? That's just not something that I like brings me joy and makes me want to get out of bed in the morning. And I figured that out after I like, did some personnel selection work, and I was like, wow, I hate this. Yeah.
I think that's the importance of like internships and like early on jobs too in your career, because I know it could be stressful. I know there's a lot of us, especially when other students have gone through it, where you're getting your master's and then you get this job and you're like, whoa, this kind of sucks. I am not having fun. Like I'm not having a good time. And then it kind of all sets in. You're like, well, is this what I have to do for the rest of my life? Blah, blah. But then what we say is that the best thing about IO is try the next thing. There's thousands of things to do in the degree. So you're absolutely right. Like it doesn't have to be your forever dream job.
Yeah. And that's maybe why like I think I find such passion in IOs, because it is like very much geared towards what I would consider a consultant like lifestyle and a consultant job profile, because you do have the opportunity to like be a consultant specifically in IO psychology. And that's kind of really what I do today, where I work and where I came from, as well as like being an IO consultant. And so using my IO skill set, but then also kind of really bring that in with like the business background that I have, and being able to bring that together to to kind of serve the clients, whether they're internal or external.
That's honestly a pretty good segue for us into talking about the work you do. Thanks for setting that up, Allisa. But
not planned at all.
But like talking about the type of work you do when at the Federal Reserve, like, is that more, because you mentioned consulting, is that more of an internal role or is that an external role? Like, what type of consulting are you doing and what type of work are you doing?
Yeah. So just a quick clarifying point. So I work for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So there are a number of reserve banks throughout the United States through the number of different districts. So I specifically am for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, but we're all integrated into the Federal Reserve System. But second piece to that is, so I would say where I am now is I'm doing external consulting, but specifically through the lens of organizational effectiveness. So our team is small but mighty, and we do a lot, and we all act as internal consultants and do a lot of work that kind of runs the gamut of what you can see in IO psychology. Some of us kind of specialize in a little bit different areas of IO, and then some of us are a little bit more broad strokes and can kind of weave in and out of different areas. But so like for me, day to day, I work on projects that I am passionate about and also kind of where my skill set lies. So I come from a more traditional organizational development background. So things like org structure, applying organizational assessment principles, helping clients. And when we say clients, it's obviously anybody kind of in the bank or any groups inside of the bank that are looking to implement interventions for organizational effectiveness.
And do you actually work with like a lot of IOs, like who have degrees in IOs? Because I feel like IO in the government is actually like pretty plentiful.
Yeah. So another clarifying point, only I don't mean to be a stickler on it, but I know that it's confusing. So we are technically not government. We're technically a quasi-government entity that has a financial component to it. So we were enacted by Congress, but we are not considered true government or true government entity in that sense. Where you see like other government agencies and things like that are considered true government. And the reason I say that is you do see in the government there are tons and tons of IOs, and they've adopted this in spirit as well. So I work, like I said, it's a small team, but we're a team of all individuals who have either a master's in IO or a PhD in IO psychology. So that's pretty unique, I would say, for how small of an organization we are, which is approximately 3,000. And you're seeing like, we're like 5 or 6 individuals. So that's a pretty big team for a small organization like that.
It's funny. I would say if you didn't make those clarifying points, Joe and I would have never known that. So
100% not.
So that's really interesting. Like the structure of it, and just when I hear it, it just sounds so different. So that's really interesting to hear. In your experience, like when you speak to org effectiveness, what type of work is that? Like I know you said like that OD background, like what does org effectiveness mean to you in the work you're doing?
Yeah. And it's kind of like a catch-all term, right? So that's kind of the reason that we do keep it in that vein, is because it really allows us to act as like IO consultants who can consult in our areas of expertise, where it's not just like, oh, this person is an IO consultant with a very heavy data-centric background, and so they're only doing listening work, or they're only doing employee like engagement work, anything like that. We do all of that, but we have the opportunity to go from like assessment work, which includes like selection and things like that, but also like structurally, and then all the way through listening, employee engagement, well-being, and then even it kind of bridges into like thought leadership around true like behavioral science and being the experts in that space and bring that information to the bank.
It sounds interesting, and the question that comes to mind is, if you don't get it, just let me know because I don't know how I'm going to word it. But the one thing that I've been learning is that the work that you do kind of can depend on like the industry you're in, which makes sense.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, is the work that you do in org effectiveness like super specific to the quasi governmental Federal Reserve like data, like, or would you be doing a similar thing if you worked in like a tech company or like a fashion company, if that makes
Yeah.
some sense?
Yeah, no, totally makes sense. So I guess I'll give like the classic answer of like, it depends.
Knew it.
Essentially, yes, I think some of the work that we perform is specific to the clients that we're working with in the sense that like the different individuals and the different departments that are within the bank. But I would say like broad strokes, like the work that we do is found in all organizations that hire a team of IOs. So they are going to be doing very similar work that we do. And a good example of that is all organizations do surveys, right? All organizations do surveys very differently, and their probably scale of how good they are at surveys is very different. But they all do surveys. So you would see that it doesn't matter what industry, it doesn't matter quasi-governmental, government, traditional consulting, tech, whatever.
Gotcha. So like some of like the tasks or like the way that you're going to get things are going to be similar through like surveys, but maybe like the data you're working with, you might get like some different types of data.
Yeah, potentially, but I mean, like if we want to just talk about like very like traditional survey around like engagement, right? Like maybe we're still using similar measures, but we're asking stuff that's like specific to like our employee base, but and maybe we're using different tools, but we're not getting necessarily different data. We're getting data that's coming from that survey. And data is all private, right? When you're in organizations, so like we have the responsibility of being really protective over it, but I still would say like we're not using different data. We're just we're getting the data from the people that are in our employee base.
Yeah, and that makes sense too. Like, as I think about it, Joe and I have spoken about so many different applications of IO and just the different industries that it could impact. And I'm sure that if you would interpret like data, the same data you're collecting, but in maybe like a law firm, you would be taking it and seeing different results. So that sounds very like it would be more like that for you.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like, yeah, that's a good analogy. So it just depends. It also kind of depends a lot, especially for like survey work, right? It totally depends on a lot of external factors that are going on, right? I'm sure organizations have seen lots and lots of different trends in the data for engagement surveys across industries that maybe have some specific things. So I think it just really depends. But I guess to go back to the first point you made, Joe, is just IO is so broad. You can go so many ways, and you just have to kind of find what you're really passionate about and what you like, and then see how you can kind of like capitalize on like doing that work more and more, and how it really brings value to the organization that you're working in.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of to that point again, when you're working like with these surveys, I know there's some people at IO that love the data, and then some people that might be more on like I guess it would be like the O side that still like working with data, but not as much. Would you say your role is more data heavy, or to kind of depend on like the task that you're doing that day?
Yeah, so I think it depends. I would say like in general, IO psychology is moving more and more towards using stronger, better, and utilizing more data centric approaches to everything that we do, whether that maybe is like different forms of measurement. But I think you're even starting to see now that there's a push inside of organizations to use behavioral data and like clinical data. So heart rate, pulse rate, respiratory rate, things like that, when you're doing some of like your job work as well. So I would say it depends. Again, like I think we're kind of I would say we're probably in the middle, depending on like my day. But I know that we very much care about it. But you sometimes, some of your job is not just looking at the data. It's like some of the other pieces that kind of are more from like the consulting side of the house, where you're engaging with stakeholders and using your ability to like navigate those conversations.
Yeah, and I feel like what you just said there's a perfect example of what being an IO psychologist is. Like you have to walk the fine line between talking like the professional business language and then using the knowledge and skills and abilities that you've built through your IO degree and like translating that to them.
Yeah, that's like literally exactly it. Like that's the triangulation point, and that's how I try to sell IO to people who are like, I don't know what I want to do, and I'm like, well, let me tell you. But like it really is that, right? It's like having the business acumen, but also having the data side of it to be able to translate it, bring those two together. And then the last piece is the psych, the true traditional foundational psychology piece of it, and using that as the lever to try and like push those two up, because you have to like have the ability to like understand like traditional human behavior, which is all psychology, and then you have the business acumen to like navigate those stakeholders and work inside of an organization, and then the data to back it up of why this all makes sense.
This is a complete non sequitur and wasn't in the guest prep guide or anything like that, but you just got me thinking about a conversation I was having the other day. So I was speaking with somebody about like the IO work we do, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, Allisa. Like it's sometimes as IO psychologists, it's relatively a new field. And I would say that a lot of these IO teams, because you're part of an IO team that gets to do a lot of great work. So that's partially why this question came to mind. A lot of these IO teams are trying to build themselves while also helping the company. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on that and if that like reduces any effectiveness, not necessarily in your situation specifically, but just like from like conversations you've had. Because the analogy I used was like, we're building a boat while trying to get across the water.
Yeah.
And because IO is new and a lot of the stuff we're learning is growing. So like, what would be your experience, just whether talking with people or what your thoughts are on that?
Yeah. And so I'll even take it like outside of work, because I think you're totally right. Even though it's been around for a long time now, like if we look from like the history textbooks of
Right.
like IOs, like we've been around for a long time. But when I say like to people who maybe haven't met me and they're asking about my background and what I do, and I'm like, I'm an IO psychologist, they're like, so what do you do? And then, or they're like, oh my God, you're evaluating me like right now and you're in my brain. Yep. And I'm like, I don't do any of that, like at all. So yeah, I think like, regardless of like how strong maybe you are as an IO, or whether you're on a team or you're solo inside of an organization, it is still a rebranding or a new branding uphill battle that you have to make, because I think there really still is a gap in knowledge about what IOs do and what IOs can do and how effective they are inside of organizations. And so you have to almost like kind of put on your marketing hat and say like, this is all the cool things I can do, and this is how it's going to provide you business value at the end of the day. And so, yeah, I think your analogy of like, we are building the boat while going across the river, or whatever one you want to use, like we're building the plane and flying it at the same time. I think probably almost every IO is currently experiencing that or has experienced that in their career.
Yeah, and just to close the loop on that, I know it was like a non sequitur, but it just really got me thinking about it. Like the fact is as IOs, we were talking about how we have to walk that tightrope walk, and part of that tightrope walk that we haven't necessarily discussed on this episode, but on this podcast is like stakeholder buy-in and like trying to get people's engagement in what we're doing. And it's really, really true. Like what if a really strong, solid IO can do all of those things and use the data, use the psychology, and use the business acumen to not only take the boat across the water, but like get the finished product as well. And I think that's exactly what you were saying there, Allisa. Like it does depend but it is still something that we're looking at, and we're seeing that in our work on a day-to-day.
Yeah. And it's really hard, right? Because all organization and structure, if they have an IO department or they have an IO team or even just a singular, where they put them, right? That's the other piece too. Like, where do we really live? Do we live in human resources? Do we live in strategy? Are we embedded in like some other center of excellence? Like, I think it's all really hard for people to navigate it because they don't know who we are or what we can do, and then we kind of really don't fit anywhere very easily. So yeah, I think it's hard. I think we're working on it. I think this podcast is hopefully continuing to bring some information to the world of like all this stuff that we do. So cool that you guys are spreading the word.
We try our best. I wonder what it's really going to look like in like 20, 30, 40 years, like IO as a field, because I feel like it's already grown so much. Just we see like the standing at PsyOp alone, like how many people there, and even to the point where I've seen people at other companies that don't have IO degrees but have heard of it and have heard of PsyOp too, and they're like, oh, like I was actually kind of thinking about maybe attending one of those because it seems really interesting, and like people speak really highly of it. So it'd be cool to see like what happens in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's going to get amped up a lot more in my spare time, all that spare time I have. I like kind of look up sometimes like what are the trends in undergraduate degrees now, and you're starting to see that there are either individual like undergrad degrees starting to grow and being IO psychology, or there's a concentration of IO psychology for an undergrad in psych. So I think we've hopefully are starting to see, and I don't know if y'all experience this in your undergrad, but when I went to undergrad, there was a huge push for clinical psych. And IO psych was just not a thing. We had I had one class in it, and I was like, whoa, this is cool. Like, how come nobody's talking about this? But I think we're starting to see now that other people are interested in it. It kind of whets the appetite of people who did not want to go the clinical route, but are still really interested in human behavior. So we're starting to see an uptick there too.
Yeah, Joe and I speak about that a lot. I won't speak for Joe in this because I know Joe was potentially going the clinical route, and I can let you tell that story, Joe. But the fact is I didn't even come from psych. I came from business, and so it's pulling from a lot of places, which is great because that means that you can see the impact is growing as well. Like I learned about IO Psych in undergrad through like a management course, and it was something that I didn't realize existed. And we had a great episode with Dr. Ben Butina about growing IO Psych, like what can we do to grow it, and just plugging that episode there really quick. But just doing that and like growing the field of IO, it is so important because like people see the effectiveness and the use of it, but they don't necessarily know. So how can they use it if they don't know?
Yeah, it's chicken or the egg. I don't know how to solve it. I think one piece is it should be embedded inside of business schools for undergrad. Number one, like there should definitely be a concentration in IO Psych for business. I don't know if that's the right language for it, but it should definitely be in business schools, and it should be in psych departments. So I don't know. Maybe 100%. It's its own department.
It would be cool if there was its own like concentration, like as you were saying. It would save so many students so many like thoughts of what should I do with my psych degree.
Yeah.
Because I know I wasn't the only one who thought that.
No, I went through it too. I went the clinical route first, and I was like, I hate this.
Yeah, like, and then you think about it, you're like, wait, I have to be like a therapist or a clinical psychologist. Like, well, hold on, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
But really, if it's like I didn't have a IO Psych class in my undergrad. I had to ask my professors, and they were like, "Oh yeah, I know some people that work in IO psychology, and they really like it." And I was like, "Oh, could have saved me, a semester and a half of stress." But yeah, if it's just like a class, like a minor, just to get them interested, and then they can start doing their own research, I think it would do a lot for the brand of IO psychology itself.
Yeah, agreed.
So, Allisa, you mentioned earlier about your spare time, and I wanted to kind of backtrack to that because we, as Joe and I do before we have somebody on, we look over their like profile and their history and what they've done. And we saw that you recently got a certification. And for that certification, like, would you be able to speak to that certification in any way, or like what prompted that? How does it help you in your work, and kind of if anyone could get any other value out of that as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I happen to work in an organization that I would say puts learning and development as a crux inside of like how you continue to grow in the organization. So they give us the opportunity to do certifications and things like that. So I'm not sure which one you're referring to because there's two in the past like 2 weeks. Yeah. So, but both of them are really very much centered around user experience or human experience through the different systems of design. So, like a systems design thinking or a process design thinking. But it's really all about like, how do you make sure that the experience on the other end is palatable to that person from all of the changes that you may be making. And so from an IO perspective, right, it's like, okay, if I'm doing anything that's like a major intervention, and I'll use like an outside example, but let's say Hofstra decided to put a burnout intervention into place for their students. Like, how do you get people to get on board with that? How do you think about it from a systems perspective? And how do you interpret their experience to make sure that it's accounted for and that you're not just like rolling out this change and they're not accepting it? So it's less like, oh, this is an IO certification. It's very much like I've applying my IO skill set, which is doing interventions and making changes for the betterment of the organization. But how do I get people on board with it and make sure their experience is positive?
One thing that I found interesting when looking at your certifications was the Hogan assessments. And personally, I also just got certified in that. So I would love to know the type of work that, or the type of work you're doing. How is Hogan assisting in that area?
So it's a good question. I think maybe I'm in a role where I'm not using it quite as much as some other individuals who are maybe going the route of more like traditional coaching or executive coaching, which is obviously an avenue of IO Psych. How I would say like I do use it because I do think it's a really great certification is I kind of know what are some of the flags to spot for when I'm working with stakeholders to see like, okay, is this maybe kind of like their style and how can I mirror it or not mirror it to show the difference? So I think it's just like a good thing to have in your back pocket because it's knowledge and it gives you a way to navigate stakeholders that doesn't feel like, oh, I'm just like kind of flying by the seat of my pants.
So it's a great point. We've heard from especially a lot of our professors like that, not just the importance of the Hogan, but like the flexibility of it, the things that you can do with that sort of certification. And I know that we're nearing the end, but I love the point that you brought up before about like UX design and user design and like user interface. I think it's such, maybe not niche, but just such a specific part that kind of does fit into IO that is not really talked much about, to the point where a couple of days ago, I was actually looking up people in UX design to try to get on the podcast because it's so interesting. And I think people with a master's in IO psychology can provide a lot of help like in that area.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess a shameless plug. If anyone knows anyone in UX design, we'd love to have you on. But you're really, it's a really cool point. I'm hoping that maybe we can get some more IOs in that area.
Yeah.
But I guess for our last question, so we don't run too long, do you have maybe one piece of advice for either IO students or just students in general entering the field and the workforce?
I guess what I would say as my piece of advice for students in IO specifically is at the end of the day, you are trying to provide business value and how you can translate that. And so the more experience or the more opportunity you have to better understand the business that either you're going into or the organization that you're going into or the product lines that they're servicing, whatever it is, you have to speak their language for them to get buy-in from you. And so I think in the beginning, in general, that was like a flip switch I had to do, because I was like, oh, I'm just gonna like tell you all about the data, and this is regressions, and this is what I'm seeing. And they were like, I don't care about that, right? Like, I just want to know, how does this impact my bottom line, and how is this going to make a difference? And so that's kind of like, you got to start with the headline and then backtrack.
It's great advice. The business acumen portion of it doesn't get so much overlooked in master's programs, because we definitely have those projects where they're like, we know you did the data, but we need to like be a little bit more professional in the way we present it. But there is an aspect of that kind of gets like pushed under the rug. And I don't know if we've had that exact piece of advice, but I'm really glad you said it, because we only have 2 years in this program, which might seem like a long time, but it's really not. Like, I can't believe that Brandon and I are halfway through our first semester, second year. I didn't even know I was going to, like, I feel like I'm still, in my senior year. So it goes by fast. And without that sort of like reminder that you're not just still doing schoolwork in the workforce, you kind of get led down that pathway of as you were saying, like, oh, the regression, the data. What do you mean? Isn't this what you want? They're like, no, we want answers.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and for anybody who's thinking about a PhD, like, you're going to go even further down that route, like less business specific. So you got to try and always, like, I think, bring it back, especially if you want to go like a more consulting route as an IO psychologist. Because that's all they kind of want to know at the end of the day. They don't really want to know what the regressions were, what the ANOVAs. They don't care about the F score at all.
As a consultant as well, I would say that I've definitely learned to lead with, like, I've been making a lot of presentations and slide decks, and always creating like an action title, so I know exactly what I'm doing and people can see exactly what's going to be on the slide. And that's been something that I've learned a lot, like in consulting, but in general, that's just IO. Mm-hmm. Like, you've got to sell it and it's got to look like, and everyone's got to know what they're looking at. And then from there, then you can kind of take it and go down some other different avenues somewhat. And as long as you keep everybody engaged and involved, like we said, stakeholder buy-in is just so important.
Yeah, exactly. You guys got it. So just keep rolling with it, I guess.
We'll see what happens in the next year or two. If we can actually, do it.
Well, and you're gonna make mistakes in the beginning, and that's okay. Like, we all make mistakes. You gotta just try and then like recover. Be better at recovering than like your first try sometimes. It's fine.
Yeah, and in general, I would just say stakeholder buy-in is something that all IOs struggle with at any point of their career. So it's not something that we would just say is, oh, we didn't get it our first try, like we can try again. Yeah. Like
exactly.
But Allisa, we want to thank you so much for your time today and for coming on the podcast with Joe and I. It's been a real treat. And I know we get to see you at Metro all the time, and now I'm going to get to work with you a little bit on stuff in Metro, but I'm super happy that we got to have you on here finally. It's super awesome.
No, thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited to see how this turns out. I'm excited for y'all. Like, this is such a cool idea, and I'm so happy to see that people are like doing this, because like I don't have the creativity to do this. So like, this is like a blessing, such a blessing, like, to the IO community, truly.
We appreciate it. We're just happy that people say yes and want to come on the podcast.
Yeah.
I'm just waiting for the one day where someone says no, and then we're like, all right, Brandon, that's it.
We're done.
Like, this everywhere. I'm going to be like, guys, I was on a podcast.
Let's go.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you for coming on. I'm excited for people to hear.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I'll see you all soon, and thanks again.
See you.
Yeah. Thank you. So, Joe, another great episode. We've been trying really hard to get Allisa on this podcast, so I'm so happy that we were able to have her on here. We got to listen to her speak at Metro during the panels that they did for Career Day, and we both, I remember, turned to each other like, we need to get her on the podcast. So it's awesome that full circle moment. She's here, and she really gave us some good insight into her work and just being an IO in general. I felt like her advice and just conversation was very valuable.
100%. It was definitely worth the wait. I think it was like a month in the making of like trying to fit our schedules in. But I'm very happy we were able to get her on. Just her perspective on IO as a field, about the things you could do with it, and her her perspective on like trying to fit IO into the workplace was just really great to hear about.
You know, there's a lot of value for the IOs that work in teams with other IOs because I feel like they have a different perspective than IOs who are trying to work in companies where they don't have any other IOs around them, because they really get to like do the work that IOs want to do, you know?
Yeah, we've talked about it before where it's like sometimes I'm the only IO in this job and you want to utilize the knowledge that you have, but sometimes it's hard to teach non-IOs other IO work on like the fly when you're doing all this other work. So actually be able to work with other IOs is kind of like such a great experience.
Yeah, 100%. And like you hit the nail on the head. It's just great experience to learn. And honestly, like just awesome episode with Allisa. Like we really do appreciate having her on here. And we want to thank you guys so much for listening. Make sure you guys tune in next week and we will catch you guys then.
Yep. Thanks for listening, everybody.